My daughter sat on the living room rug with her knees tucked under her, and she laid out the supplies like she had done it 100 times. Tissues first, folded and stacked. Then the cold pack, still stiff from the freezer, wrapped in a thin dish towel so it would not burn her skin. A small roll of gauze. A trash bag opened wide like a black mouth. And the bucket, clean and waiting, placed close enough that she did not have to stand up if the blood came fast. Her hands were so small that the bucket looked too big beside her, and that was what made my stomach drop. A 4-year-old should not have a system for bleeding. The room around her still looked like a kid's room, and that was the part that hurt in a quiet way. Plush animals were lined up on the couch. A coloring book lay open on the coffee table, with a crayon pressed into the page like someone had stopped mid-stroke. A plastic cup with a cartoon character sat beside my phone charger. And right there, mixed into it all, were emergency things that never belonged in a home like ours. Cold packs stacked behind juice boxes, gauze stuffed into a drawer with stickers, a digital thermometer beside a toy stethoscope. It all blended together until it almost looked normal, until you saw her laying out her bleeding kit with the calm focus of an adult. I stayed close enough to move fast, but not so close that I crowded her. I had learned that part the hard way. When I rushed, she got tense, and tension made everything worse. So I kept my face steady and my hands ready. One part of my mind stayed in parent mode, counting supplies and watching her breathing. The other part stayed somewhere darker, where I imagined blood that would not stop, and car rides to the hospital, and nurses pressing gauze to skin that bruised too easily. Those two parts ran at the same time, and I hated that I had gotten good at it. For nearly 3 years, her illness had turned our home into a place where we waited, not for visitors or birthdays, but for sudden bleeding that could start with no warning, like a switch flipping inside her. We did not talk about it in big, dramatic ways. We did not decorate the walls with fear. We did something worse, something quieter. We adjusted. We made space for it. We built routines around it. We told ourselves that routine meant control. The kid existed because the episodes never looked the same. Sometimes it was a simple nosebleed that stopped before she got scared. Sometimes it was heavier, and the blood soaked through tissue after tissue until the pile looked wrong, like something from a medical room, not our living room floor. The trash bag was for the used tissues, because leaving them exposed made the smell cling to everything, and I could not stand that smell lingering near her toys. The gauze was for when tissues fell apart. The cold pack was for the swelling and the pressure we hoped would help. The bucket was for the times she could not swallow fast enough, the times she coughed and the red came up again, the times I did not want her choking on her own blood. The worst part was that she often knew before I did. She could sense it starting in a way I could not explain. She would pause, tilt her head slightly, and then she would move with purpose. She would sit down. She would reach for the kit. She would wait, not like a child waiting for a snack, but like someone waiting for something painful and familiar. That look on her face was not panic. was preparation. It was acceptance. A few weeks earlier, I had seen blood in her eye. Not a small red line, not a tiny spot. It filled part of the white like ink spilled under glass. She did not scream. She did not cry the way I expected. She blinked slowly and held still while I stared, frozen, trying to force my brain to make it into something else. I remembered my own breath turning thin and quick, like I had been running. I remembered how my hands shook while her stayed calm. Even then, some part of me tried to bargain with reality. I tried to treat it like a strange, one-time thing. Like the body sometimes did impossible things, and then went back to normal. But normal never came back. Normal became this: a living room with stuffed animals and a bucket, a freezer with ice cream and cold packs, a child who knew where the gauze was kept without being told. So this was the baseline: a 4-year-old with a routine for bleeding. I watched her fingers smooth the top tissue like she was setting a table. She pressed the cold pack against her nose for a moment, testing it. She positioned the bucket closer with a small shove. No hesitation, no confusion, only practice. I stood there with my heart beating too hard, trying to stay quiet so she could stay calm. And I realized I had been pretending for a long time that this was temporary, that we were still in the part where things turned around, that someday we would pack the kid away and laugh at how overprepared we had been. Her nose had not started yet, not fully, but I saw the first dark shine at one nostril. She lowered her chin the way she had been taught. She reached for the tissues. And today, the routine was about to last far longer than anyone could pretend was normal. I had lived in a strange kind of math for almost 3 years. I counted good days like they were proof. If she went a week without blood, I treated it like a victory that erased the week before. If she bled twice in one day, I told myself it meant nothing if the next day looked quiet. I measured fear in small doses, like I could control it by keeping it small. I kept my voice steady. I kept the house stocked. I kept telling myself that we were managing. Her disorder never announced itself in a clean way. It arrived the way accidents arrived. A sudden red line at her nose, a wet tissue that should have been enough but never was, blood on her sleeve from wiping too fast, a tiny cough that turned into red in the sink. There were moments when her skin looked too pale, when her lips looked wrong, when she moved like her body was heavier than it should have been. And still, I tried to believe in patterns that were not real. I tried to believe that if I prepared enough, nothing would surprise me. The belief I held onto was simple and cruel. She was sick, but not that sick. She needed doctors, but not the scary kind of doctors. She needed medicine, but not the kind that failed. She needed monitoring, but not the kind that made nurses look at each other before they looked at me. That belief was the only way I functioned. It was the only way I could wash dishes, or answer messages, or sit beside her bed without shaking. I needed the story in my head to be smaller than the truth. I remember how I used language to shrink it. I called episodes flare-ups, like a rash. I called the bleeding annoying, like it was only messy. I called the hospital visits checks, even when we stayed for hours, and left with new instructions and new fear. When I said it out loud, it sounded like we were in control. When I said it quietly to myself, it sounded like a prayer. I saw how much I relied on that story whenever she surprised me with her own calm. She did not act like a child who thought she would be rescued. She acted like a child who knew rescue had limits. She moved to her kit without asking. She waited for me without panic. She tried to keep her breathing slow, like she had learned that crying made things worse. That should have broken my denial right away. Instead, I used it as proof that it was not an emergency. I told myself that if she could stay calm, then it could not be that dangerous. Even the worst moments did not fully break it. When the blood appeared in her eye, bright and wrong, I stood there and told myself it would clear. I watched it spread across the white like a stain under glass, and I still tried to make it smaller. I searched my memory for harmless explanations. I told myself the body did strange things, and children recovered fast. I held her hand and kept my face still, because if I admitted what I felt, it would come out as terror. At the same time, I tried everything the doctors offered. We cycled through treatments that promised stability, then slipped away. Each new medication arrived with a careful hope, the kind you tried not to speak too loudly. Each one also carried a quiet warning in the fine print of conversations and lab results. I learned to recognize the look on a clinician's face when they did not want to scare me, but could not lie. I learned to accept words like rare and unpredictable without screaming. And still, I kept building my life around the idea that this was temporary. I pictured a future where the kit went into a closet and stayed there. I pictured school pictures without bruises. I pictured vacations without checking the nearest emergency room. I pictured a version of myself who did not flinch at the sight of red. For years, the story in my head was, we could manage this. Managing meant routines. It meant extra towels in the bathroom. It meant sheets washed more often than normal. It meant dark clothes for days when blood appeared without warning. It meant teaching myself to clean without letting her see the panic in my hands. It meant never letting the house run out of cold packs. It meant staying ready in a way that looked responsible from the outside and felt like living on the edge of a cliff from the inside. Every time she seemed okay, I grabbed it. I used it to patch the holes in my mind. I used it to convince myself I was not failing her. I used it to keep going. Then the bleeding days started to stretch longer. The pauses between them got shorter. My kit supplies disappeared faster. And my daughter, who should have been learning colors and songs, stayed focused on the quiet problem inside her body that nobody could fix. Then a hospital stay arrived and rewrote the story in 1 week. She knew before the blood showed. That was the part I could not get used to, even after years. I watched her freeze in the middle of a small movement, like her body had heard a sound I could not hear. Her eyes shifted, not scared, just alert. Her mouth opened slightly as if she tasted metal in the air. Then she lowered herself to the floor with care, like sitting down was the first rule of a game she never asked to play. I stayed still for one extra second, because I had learned that rushing made her think she needed to be afraid. My hands were ready, but my face stayed calm. I watched her shoulders settle. She pulled her hair away from her cheeks with a practiced sweep, so it would not stick to wet skin later. That simple motion hit me harder than any hospital monitor ever had. It looked like something someone taught her in training, but she had taught herself. She reached for the kit without looking. The bucket slid across the rug with a dull scrape. Tissues went on her lap first, always within reach. Then a second pile went beside her, because she hated having to ask for more once it started. The cold pack came next, wrapped in cloth, placed near her elbow like it was part of her body. Gauze last, because gauze meant it was more than a light bleed. She lined it all up in front of her, neat and quiet, like she was setting out crayons. I watched the checklist happen in her small hands and felt two emotions at once, and they did not fit together. Pride came first, sharp and unwanted. She was brave. She stayed calm. She did what she had to do. Then grief followed right behind it, heavier, because no 4-year-old should need bravery like that. The pride felt wrong in my mouth, like I had swallowed something bitter. Her breathing stayed slow. She tilted her chin down a little. The way we had learned helped keep blood from running the wrong direction. She pressed the cold pack to the bridge of her nose with steady pressure, not too hard. She closed her eyes for a moment, like she was listening to her own body. I wanted to tell her she did not have to be the strong one. I wanted to trade places with her. But all I could do was sit close and wait for the first drop to prove she had been right again. When the bleed started, it did not start like an accident. It started like a faucet opening. One dark bead formed, then stretched, then slid into the tissue. She did not jerk or cry. She simply swapped the tissue with another before the first one could soak through. The movements were smooth and small. She kept her hands low so she would not smear blood up her face. She kept her shoulders relaxed, like tension would make it worse. She acted like she had done this in a classroom. The sound was what I remembered most. A wet, soft sound when the tissue pressed against skin. A faint drip into the bucket when she leaned forward to clear her mouth. The small crinkle of plastic as I opened the trash bag wider. Every noise felt too loud in a house that tried to pretend it was normal. My eyes tracked the red stains spreading through white paper. I counted tissues without meaning to, the way some people counted seconds. She looked up at me once, only once, and her eyes stayed calm. There was no question in them. There was only a silent request for me to keep doing my part. In that moment, I understood that her illness had trained her, and it had trained me too. We had learned roles. She prepared and endured. I supplied and cleaned and watched for danger. We both pretended it was temporary, because the alternative felt like falling. The bleed continued, and time changed shape. Minutes felt like hours. The bucket became the center of the room. The couch and toys and pictures on the wall turned into scenery around an emergency. I replaced cold packs as they warmed. I tied off the trash bag when it grew heavy with ruined tissues. I checked her lips for color, her fingers for coldness, her eyes for that distant look that meant she was getting tired. She remained quiet, like quiet could control the amount of blood leaving her body. What broke me was how she adjusted on her own. When a tissue stuck for a second, she waited before pulling it away, because she had learned that tearing it off too fast made the bleed restart harder. When she felt a cough coming, she leaned over the bucket before it happened. When blood ran toward her throat, she spit with precision, not disgust, not fear. She behaved like a person who expected this, like a person who had already accepted it. I realized then that my denial had not protected her. It had only protected me. She had lived inside the truth the whole time. She had felt it coming. She had felt it start. She had felt it last. And she had learned to manage it because she could not wait for adults to feel ready. When a child prepared herself for blood, something in you broke quietly. I stayed by her side until my legs went numb, and the tissues kept piling up, and the bucket kept filling in small amounts that still felt impossible. The routine kept going long after the point where any part of it could be called normal. And while I watched her hold herself together, I started to understand that the real confirmation of how bad this was would not come from our living room floor. But the scariest confirmation did not happen at home. It happened in the hospital. We arrived at the hospital with her small hand inside mine and dried blood still shadowing the skin under her nose. I had told myself we only needed a check. I had told myself we would get numbers, get a plan, and go back home. But the moment we walked into the bright, cold air of the intake area, I felt the shift. People moved faster. The chairs were too clean. The lights made her look even paler, and the staff did not treat it like a simple nosebleed. Everything started with routine steps that carried hidden weight: a wristband, a scale, a cuff tightening around her arm until she frowned, a finger clip that measured her oxygen like she was a machine that could fail without warning. Then the blood draw. Her body stayed still while her eyes watched the needle with a focus that did not belong to her age. I stood beside her and counted her breaths because I could not count anything else. The first few hours stretched and snapped at the same time. A room with a bed too big for her, a thin blanket, a call button she could not reach, the constant beep and hush of the hallway outside the door. I tried to anchor myself in small facts. She was awake. She was not crying. She was watching cartoons on my phone. She was still here, still my little girl. But the nurses kept coming back in, checking her more often than they had before. And I started to feel like time was being measured in silent decisions I was not part of. When the care team returned with the first set of lab results, I saw it in their faces before I understood the words. Their expressions looked careful, like they were holding something fragile that might cut me. They said the anemia was severe. They said her platelets were extremely low, so low they were hard to measure at all. At one point, I heard a phrase that stayed in my head like a bruise. Undetectable. It did not sound like a number. It sounded like absence. I had lived for years telling myself she was sick, but not that sick. Those words had kept me moving. They had kept me functional. But in that room, the belief started to crack. It was not a dramatic moment. It was a quiet one. My mind reached for the usual excuses and found nothing solid to grab. They began monitoring her like she was unstable, even when she looked calm. That contrast made me feel dizzy. She sat cross-legged on the bed, swinging her feet, asking for water with a dry mouth. She looked like a normal child waiting to go home. Then a nurse would step in and check her vitals again. Another would look closely at her gums, her skin, the tiny marks that most people would never notice. Every small red spot felt like a warning sign written in a language only they could read. By the first night, the hospital stopped feeling like a place we visited and started feeling like a place we lived. The hallway noises became part of my breathing. The smell of sanitizer stuck to my hands, no matter how many times I washed them. I slept in pieces, sitting upright, waking every time her body shifted. Each time she moved, my brain asked the same question. Was she bleeding somewhere I could not see? The second day came with more blood work, more waiting, and a deeper kind of fear. I watched the staff handle her with gentle skill, but I also watched them pause before speaking, choosing words like they were stepping around something sharp. I saw how quickly they responded to small changes. I saw how they checked her numbers, then checked her again, like they were hoping the results were wrong. My denial did not survive that. Denial needed space and noise. The hospital gave me silence and facts. On the third day, the sense of helplessness became physical. I felt it in my throat like a tight collar. At home, I had my kit. I had my routines. I had tasks to do that made me feel useful. In the hospital, I had nothing to manage. I could not press the right spot or swap the right tissue and make this better. I could only watch people in scrubs do what they could while my daughter tried to be brave for them and for me. She grew tired in a way I had seen before, but never this steady. Not sleepy tired, empty tired. She still smiled sometimes, but it looked like effort. Her skin stayed pale under the harsh light. When she held my finger in her hand, her grip felt lighter than it should have been. I caught myself staring at her chest, waiting for the rise and fall, because my body did not trust quiet anymore. The fourth day was the day I stopped pretending. I still did not say it out loud, not to her, not to anyone. But inside me, something shifted into place like a lock turning. The numbers did not care about my hope. The staff did not soften their concern because I had managed well at home. Severe anemia and platelets so low they could barely be found meant we were not dealing with a rough patch. We were dealing with a body that could not protect itself. At home, I could pretend it was manageable. In a hospital, numbers and silence hit harder. When we finally left after 4 days, I carried more than a bag of belongings. I carried the memory of that word, undetectable, like it had been stamped onto my skin. I carried the knowledge that the routine in our living room had been practice for something bigger than I wanted to admit. I buckled her into her seat and watched her head tip to the side with exhaustion, and I realized my old story had ended. And then the next thing happened, the thing I still could not say without feeling my throat close. A wish was granted. The message about the wish arrived like a soft knock on a door I had been leaning my whole weight against. It did not come with sirens. It did not come with a doctor speaking in a grave voice. It came politely, almost gently, the way people approached families like ours when they wanted to offer something kind without making it feel like pity. I stared at the words until they stopped looking like words. Make a wish. Granted. Processed. Next steps. It should have felt like a gift. It should have made me breathe easier. Instead, I felt my stomach turn cold because my brain snapped the pieces together faster than my heart could handle. I knew what a wish meant. Everyone knew, even if they pretended they did not. A wish meant your child qualified. A wish meant somebody looked at the file and the diagnosis and the recent hospital stay and decided this was not only serious, it was serious in a way that counted. It was serious in an official way. I had spent years living in the space between sick and that sick. I had built an entire life inside that distance. I had made routines and kits and calm faces. I had learned how to smile during appointments. I had learned how to speak about blood like it was a weather problem. Some days were worse. Some days were better. We adjusted. We managed. That was my language. That was my shield. The wish walked right through it. I tried to tell myself it was just support, just kindness, just something meant to lift her up. I tried to argue with my own fear. She was 4. She loved simple things. She deserved something magical after everything she had endured. That part of me wanted to grab the wish with both hands and never let go. But the other part of me heard the hospital again. The careful voices, the pauses before answers, severe anemia, platelets so low they were almost not there, undetectable. Those were not words you could wash off. Those were not words you could outwork. And now there was a wish, like a stamp pressed onto the truth I had avoided. Gratitude and dread sat in the same place inside me, and they felt almost identical. My chest tightened. My hands went numb. I stared at my daughter across the room while she played with something small, her face calm, her body tired in that quiet way I had learned to fear. She looked like a child. She looked like my baby. And suddenly, the word qualified echoed in my head, not as paperwork, but as a sentence. I felt guilty for the dread. I felt guilty for not celebrating right away. I felt guilty for thinking about what it meant instead of only thinking about her happiness. I hated myself for the way my mind worked, how it ran straight toward the worst interpretation, how it turned a gift into a warning. But I could not stop. A wish sounded like joy, but in that moment it landed like a warning. It changed the meaning of everything in our house. The bleeding kit stopped feeling like an overreaction and started feeling like a sign. The cold packs in the freezer stopped being supplies and started being evidence. The bucket stopped being a tool and started being a symbol of how many times we had watched blood leave her body and called it manageable. Even the good moments shifted. A quiet afternoon did not feel like peace anymore. It felt like a pause. Her laughter did not erase the fear. It only made it sharper because it reminded me what I could lose. And the worst part was how quickly my mind went to time. I had tried not to think in timelines. I had tried not to count months. Now, the wish made time feel like something standing behind me, close enough that I could feel its breath. I looked at her and imagined telling her about it. I imagined her face lighting up. I imagined her choosing something she loved, something bright and harmless. The thought warmed me for a second, and then the warmth turned into pain, because I knew I would be smiling while a part of me was breaking. That night, after she fell asleep, the house felt different. The silence was heavier than usual. I sat near her bed and listened for her breathing like I always did, but I also listened to the thoughts I had been pushing away for years. They were not abstract anymore. They were not future worries. They were present, sitting in the room with me. The wish had been granted, and I could not pretend I did not know what that meant. Not fully, not anymore. Now I had to survive the thoughts I avoided for years. After the wish came through, my mind replayed the hospital in pieces, like a film I could not turn off. It did not replay the big moments first. It replayed the small ones that I had tried to ignore. The way the nurse checked her gums with a quiet focus. The way someone looked at the monitor before they looked at me. The way my daughter's arm looked too thin under the blood pressure cuff. The way the hallway light spilled under the door all night, like the room never fully belonged to us. I kept hearing that word in my head. Undetectable. It did not sound like medicine. It sounded like something missing that should never be missing. And once my brain held on to that, it started grabbing everything else and pulling it into the same shape. I realized how much work denial had taken. It had not been passive. It had been a daily job. I had edited every story before I told it to anyone, and I had edited it again before I told it to myself. I had sanded down every sharp detail so I could keep moving. I had called emergency supplies preparedness, like I was only being smart. I had called 5-hour bleeding episodes bad luck, like luck had anything to do with it. I had treated every quiet day like a reset, like her body had forgiven itself. Denial had let me function, but it had also kept me trapped in a loop. It had forced me to stay alert all the time while pretending I was not. It had made me jump at small sounds and then act normal. It had made me memorize the distance to the hospital, but still tell myself we would not need it. I had lived with two brains in one head. One brain had planned for disaster. The other brain had insisted disaster was not really coming. After the wish, those two brains collided. I sat in the dark near my daughter's bed and watched her sleep. Her eyelashes rested against her cheeks. Her mouth opened slightly when she breathed. She looked peaceful, and that peace made me feel worse because I knew how fragile it was. Even asleep, She looked like she had been running for days. Her body held a tiredness that did not match her age. I tried to bargain one last time. I tried to tell myself that kids recovered. I tried to tell myself that numbers changed. I tried to tell myself that this was a low point and we would climb out. But every bargain ended in the same place. We had tried treatments. We had tried medications. We had watched hope rise and then fall again. The hospital stay had not been a random visit. It had been a warning I could not talk my way around. The thought that finally broke through me felt simple, almost plain. She was that sick. Once I admitted it, even silently, my body reacted like it had been waiting for permission. My chest tightened. My eyes burned. My hands shook in a way I could not control. It felt like stepping off a ledge and finding out there was no ground where I expected it. I understood why I had avoided this sentence for so long. It did not come alone. It brought a line of other thoughts behind it, thoughts about risk and time and how quickly things could turn. I felt shame for how long it took me to get there, not because I had ignored her care. I had never ignored her care. I had done everything I could, but I had ignored the meaning. I had treated the bleeding like an event that happened to her, not a sign of something happening inside her that we could not control. I remembered the first time we assembled the kit. I remembered thinking it was temporary, a short season we would later laugh about. I remembered telling myself that being prepared did not mean being afraid. Now, I understood what I had really done. I had tried to build a small wall around my mind, and I had called it responsibility. Even my love had carried denial inside it. I had wanted her childhood to stay soft, so I had tried to keep the truth from hardening it. But the truth had hardened it anyway. It had taught her how to sit down before she fell. It had taught her how to lean over the bucket without making a mess. It had taught her how to stay quiet so adults would not panic. Accepting that she was that sick did not make me stronger. It made me tired in a deeper way. It felt like the end of pretending was also the end of rest. Because if I stopped pretending, I had to look straight at what I had been circling for years. This was the pivot. Not new symptoms, but a new understanding. And that understanding made every earlier episode look different. The kit stayed where other families kept toys. It sat within reach, never tucked away, because hiding it never changed the fact that we needed it. I kept it near the places she used most, like I had arranged our home around an emergency that could begin at any second. Soft blankets and children's books sat only a few steps from gauze and cold packs. That mix became our normal, and I hated how quickly I got used to it. I restocked it the way people restocked snacks. I checked tissues, counted cold packs, folded gauze into tight squares so it could be grabbed with one hand. I added trash bags because blood turned paper into something heavy and wet, and I learned that you could fill a small bag faster than you thought. I replaced the bucket when it looked too stained, even after cleaning, because I could not stand the reminder sitting in plain sight. But I always bought another bucket. I always put it back. Each item carried a meaning I never asked for. Tissues meant the beginning, the first thin streak, the moment we still hoped it would stop quickly. Gauze meant it had lasted too long. Cold packs meant we were trying to slow a body that did not know how to stop on its own. Trash bags meant I would be cleaning after, wiping down surfaces like I could erase what happened. And the bucket meant the part people did not talk about, the part I learned by living it. The bucket was not only for the blood that dripped, it was for the nausea after she swallowed too much. Sometimes the bleed ran back before we caught it, and she gagged quietly, eyes wide, trying not to scare me. The first time it happened, I panicked because I thought something worse was starting. Later, I learned it was the blood itself, sitting in her stomach, making her sick. I hated that lesson. It meant blood was not only outside her. It meant she carried it inside until her body rejected it. The kit also held time. Every time I opened it, I remembered other times. I remembered the smell of iron in the air, the way the room felt smaller, the way my ears strained for changes in her breathing. I remembered my own hands moving fast, trained by repetition. I remembered the fear that came after, when the bleeding stopped, and I still could not relax because I did not trust the stopping. I tried to stay steady for her. I kept my voice low. I kept my movements slow. I learned to hide the tremor in my fingers by keeping them busy. If I looked frightened, she became too aware of her own body. If I acted calm, she followed my lead. That was the bargain I made with myself. I carried the panic, so she did not have to. I held it behind my ribs until it hurt. Then I swallowed it down and reached for another tissue. Sometimes the hardest moment was not the bleeding. It was the sound of her body deciding before mine did. I would hear the shift in her breathing, the way she paused, and I would already know she was about to reach for the kit. That knowledge landed like a stone in my stomach because it meant she felt it coming again. It meant she lived one step ahead of me, listening to signals no adult should ever ask a child to understand. The kit changed the way I heard the house. A quiet thump from her room could mean she had sat down too fast. The sound of a drawer sliding open could mean she had started without telling me. The ordinary noises of a home became alarms in disguise. I walked through each day with part of my mind waiting, as if the kit had trained my brain to scan for the next spill of red. I told myself the kit made us prepared. I told myself it made us safe. But after the hospital and after the wish, I could not pretend it was only practical. It felt like an object that proved what I had tried not to name. The kit was not just supplies. It was proof that this was real, and proof became unbearable when I remembered the eye. I had learned to measure time in attempts, not in months, not in seasons, but in the space between one treatment plan and the next. Each time the care team suggested something new, I grabbed it like it was a rope thrown into dark water. I nodded. I took notes. I followed every instruction with the kind of focus people saved for emergencies, because for us, it always was. We had tried so many medications and approaches that the names blurred together in my head. Some were pills, Some were infusions. Some were short trials that promised a quick change. Some were longer stretches that required patience, like patience could build platelets the way sleep built strength. With every new attempt, I felt the same lift in my chest, the dangerous feeling of maybe. Maybe this was the one. Maybe the bleeding would stop being a regular event. Maybe the kit could move to a closet and collect dust. For a few days, sometimes a few weeks, I lived inside that maybe. I watched her skin for fewer bruises. I checked her nose every morning. I held my breath when she ran or bumped into furniture, waiting to see if blood followed. I took normal sounds and tried to turn them into proof. A quiet day became evidence. A good night of sleep became a sign. I did not allow myself to speak hope too loudly, but I still carried it like something fragile in my hands. Then it always happened. Not in a dramatic way at first. Small bleeds returned. Spots appeared. The routine started again. And the lab results, when they came, did not show the change we needed. Sometimes there was a small improvement that vanished the next time. Sometimes there was nothing at all, as if we had poured effort into a body that could not use it. The disappointment never arrived cleanly. It came in layers. First came confusion because I wanted a straight line. Try a thing, get better, go home. But her illness did not respect storylines. Then came anger, quiet and bitter, because I was doing everything right. I was showing up. I was staying calm. I was keeping her safe as best I could. I was living in constant readiness. And still, the bleeding continued like it did not care about our work. The hardest part was how hope became a trap. Every time I let myself believe, the fall hurt worse. I started to fear good news because it made me vulnerable. I started to fear new plans because new plans meant new expectations, and expectations meant another crash when the bleeding returned. There were moments when I caught myself wanting to refuse the next attempt, not because I did not want help, but because I could not stand the emotional whiplash anymore. But I never refused. I could not, because doing nothing felt like choosing the worst outcome. If there was even a small chance something could help, I had to take it. That was the box I lived in. Action on one side, powerlessness on the other. I moved constantly, but I stayed trapped in the same space. I also carried guilt that did not make sense. I felt guilty when a treatment failed, as if my hope had caused it. I felt guilty when I felt angry, as if anger was ungrateful. I felt guilty when I felt tired, as if my exhaustion meant I loved her less. And underneath all of it was a fear I did not want to name. The fear that the list of options was not endless. The fear that we were walking toward a wall. After the 4 days in the hospital, that wall felt closer. The numbers had been too extreme to ignore. The staff had been too careful. The word undetectable had changed the air in the room. And the wish had changed something else in me, something private. It made every failed attempt feel heavier, because it suggested the world outside our home could see what I had tried not to see. Sometimes I stood near the kit and stared at it like it was a verdict. Tissues, gauze, cold packs, a bucket. tools for managing a problem we could not solve. The kit did its job. It helped us get through episodes. It kept things cleaner, safer, calmer. But it never prevented anything. It never stopped the first drop. It never stopped the next one. Effort did not always equal improvement. And that was the cruel part. I felt boxed in by that truth. I could not quit trying. I could not pretend trying guaranteed success. I could not promise my daughter that the next time would be the last time. All I could promise was that I would be there. And even that promise scared me, because being there meant watching. And then the story returned to the day. The bleeding would not stop. I saw it before I understood it. My daughter turned her face toward the window light, and one eye looked wrong. Not sleepy, not irritated. Wrong in a way my body recognized as danger before my mind found words. The white part had darkened, and a red pool spread inside it, as if someone had poured color behind glass. For a second I stood still, because my brain refused the image. Eyes were not supposed to fill with blood. Noses bled, gums bled, skin bruised. We had a kit for that. But this was different. This was inside her face, in the place I looked when I wanted to feel safe. I moved closer and tried to keep my breathing even. I told myself it could be lighting. I told myself it could be a reflection. I shifted her gently so the light changed and the red stayed. It sat there, heavy and silent, like it belonged. She did not scream. She did not cry. She watched me the way she watched adults when they tried to hide fear, like she had learned to study the space between our faces and our voices. Her body stayed calm, and that calm frightened me more than panic would have. It meant she was used to strange things happening. It meant she expected me to handle it. My hands started to shake, so I made them busy. I checked for swelling. I checked for anything on the surface I could wipe away, because wiping meant fixing. Nothing wiped. The blood was not on her skin. It was not something I could clean. It was trapped where I could not reach, held in place by her own body. I felt the old instinct rise, the one that always tried to make it smaller. I told myself it did not hurt her. I told myself eyes healed. I told myself it looked worse than it was. Those thoughts arrived fast, like trained staff running into a room. But behind them, another thought waited, quiet and steady. If blood could collect there, it could collect anywhere. I kept my face steady, because she watched my face for permission to be afraid. That was the job I never got to clock out of. I had to be the calm in the room, even when I felt my heart slam against my ribs. I had to be the person who moved like this was manageable. I had to act like we had seen worse, because if I admitted the truth, it would spill out of me and drown us both. The image stayed sharp, red against white. A clean, bright room and a child with blood where blood did not belong. It made the house feel unsafe in a new way. The kit sat where it always sat, but it suddenly felt useless, like a small umbrella in a storm that came from inside the walls. I remembered thinking, in the most private part of my mind, that we had crossed a line. Before, the bleeding had been something that happened and ended. You wiped it. You waited. You cleaned up. You watched her color return. But the eye did not feel like an episode. It felt like a message, like her body had found another place to leak and wanted to show me there was no safe area left. After that, I started noticing how my brain changed its habits. I began checking her face more often. I watched her eyes in photos. I stared too long at her when she blinked, as if blinking could hide something new. At night, I lay awake and pictured that red pool again, and my stomach tightened as if the sight alone could cause it to happen again. Some images stayed in your mind and became a permanent alarm. That was what the eye became for me. Not a memory, a warning system that never shut off. It changed the meaning of later moments, even the small ones. A tiny spot of blood from her nose did not feel like a normal bleed anymore. It felt like a doorway opening. It made me picture blood in places I could not see. It made me hear the hospital in my head, the careful voices, the measured words, the pause before answers. I tried to keep our routines because routines kept her calm. I kept the kits stocked. I kept cold packs frozen. I kept the bucket clean and within reach. I arranged our life around readiness and pretended it was just organization. But after the eye, organization felt like superstition. Like if I placed the supplies correctly, I could control what happened next. Then today arrived, and I knew something was starting before I saw blood at all. Her body shifted in that familiar way, the way she got very still for a moment, like she listened inward. She moved toward the kit without asking, not rushing, not panicking, just doing what she had learned. I watched her small hands reach for tissues like it was a normal chore. I watched her set the bucket close because she knew what swallowing blood could do to her stomach. I watched her press the cold pack to her face with the patience of someone older than 4. And as the first drops appeared, I understood why the eye had haunted me. It had taught me that the bleeding could change form. It had taught me that the next episode could be worse, in a way I had not prepared for, because this time the bleeding did not stop. It kept going minute after minute, hour after hour, and every coping skill I had practiced started to feel too small. She knew before I did. I watched her pause in the middle of the room, eyes unfocused for a second, like she listened to a sound only she could hear. Then she walked to where the kit sat and lowered herself to the floor with care. No panic, no surprise, just routine. Her small hands pulled tissues free first, then she reached for the cold pack, then the bucket. She placed everything in a neat line in front of her, like a child setting up crayons. That was when I saw the first red line slip from her nose and darken the tissue. I sat close enough to help, but far enough that she could breathe. I held the cold pack against her face and reminded myself to stay steady. I kept my movements slow. I kept my face calm. Inside, my thoughts ran fast, counting seconds, searching for the moment when it would ease like it usually did. The first 10 minutes felt normal, the way storms felt normal when you had lived through too many. We pressed, we waited, we swapped tissues when they soaked through. I told myself it would stop. I told myself it always stopped. At 20 minutes, the tissues started to pile up. They looked too heavy for something that came from a child. I folded gauze into a tighter pad and held it in place, trying to add pressure without hurting her. She stayed very still, shoulders slightly lifted, breathing through her mouth. She stared at the bucket, not afraid of it, just aware of why it was there. At 30 minutes, the fear changed shape. It stopped being sharp and became dull, like a weight settling into my stomach. I checked her face for paleness. I watched her lips. I watched how often she swallowed, because swallowing meant blood was going down her throat where I could not measure it. At 45 minutes, I started to count in smaller units, because counting was something I could control. 1 more minute, 2 more, 5 more. I kept thinking about the hospital numbers, about how little margin she had, and the thought made my hands sweat against the cold pack. At 1 hour, I stopped calling it a nosebleed in my head. I started calling it hours. I looked at the clock and felt something sink inside me, because 1 hour was long enough to change what this meant. 1 hour was long enough for blood loss to become its own kind of danger. She shifted the bucket closer without being told. That simple movement hit me hard. It meant she understood the next part. It meant she had already lived the moment when her stomach turned. I replaced the cold pack with another, because the first one had warmed against her skin. I had kept extras in the freezer for this exact reason. I hated myself for the relief I felt at being prepared, because it meant I had accepted this as normal at some point. At 1 hour and 15 minutes, blood kept coming in slow pulses that never fully stopped. It slowed for a breath, then returned, as if her body kept trying and failing to seal something. I changed the gauze again. I wiped her upper lip with a clean tissue. I watched her blink a little too slowly. At 1 hour and 30 minutes, she swallowed and then gagged once, quiet and controlled, as if she tried to be polite about it. I pulled the bucket closer and held it steady. She leaned forward, and a thin, dark stream hit the bottom with a sound I could not forget. It was not only blood from her nose. It was blood she had carried in her stomach until her body rejected it. I cleaned her mouth with a wet cloth. I kept my voice low in my own head, telling myself to stay calm. I reminded myself that fear did not stop bleeding. Fear only made a child feel alone. At 2 hours, the floor around us looked like the aftermath of something violent, even though we had moved carefully. A small trash bag sat open beside us, heavy with soaked tissues and used gauze. The smell of iron sat in the air and refused to leave. I wondered how much she had lost and hated that I could not measure it. At 2 hours and 30 minutes, Her face looked tired in a way that felt wrong. Not sleepy, drained. I watched her chest rise and fall. I watched the skin under her eyes. I tried to decide if we were at the point where home care stopped being enough. Every instinct told me we had crossed it already, but I also knew what going in meant. Lights, needles, waiting. Another night of listening to machines. At 3 hours, time stopped feeling real. I lived inside a loop of wiping, pressing, replacing. My hands kept moving because stopping would mean admitting how afraid I was. She stayed seated like she had trained for it, leaning over the bucket when nausea rose, then sitting back up when it passed. She did not ask why it was taking so long. She did not complain. She simply endured. That endurance was the most frightening thing in the room. At 3 hours and 45 minutes, the bleeding slowed for the first time in a way I could see. The tissue came away with less red. My whole body reacted like I had been holding my breath for hours, because I had. But the relief was cautious. I had learned that slowing was not stopping. Slowing was a trick that made you relax right before it started again. At 4 hours, it picked up again. Not as heavy as before, but enough to ruin the hope I had allowed myself for half a minute. I felt anger rise, hot and useless, directed at her body, at the universe, at every failed treatment, and every promise of improvement that ended here, on the floor, with a 4-year-old holding still so she would not choke on her own blood. At 4 hours and 30 minutes, she gagged again and leaned into the bucket. The sound was softer this time, but it pulled something tight inside me. Her body acted like this was normal. My body acted like I was watching the edge of a cliff. At 5 hours, the bleeding finally slowed into a smear instead of a flow. The tissues came away with pink instead of red. The gauze looked less soaked. I kept pressure anyway, because I did not trust anything about this moment. When I finally eased my hand away, I waited for the fresh surge that usually followed. It did not come right away. The room felt too quiet after so much constant motion. The trash bag sat swollen beside us. The bucket sat between her knees, streaked and heavy. She looked at it, then at her hands, then back down again, as if she checked that the routine had worked. I wanted to celebrate. I wanted to cry. I wanted to be grateful. All I felt was hollow, because 5 hours changed something in me. We were not at a nosebleed anymore. We were at hours. We were at endurance. We were at the point where a child's calm did not comfort me, it warned me. When she finally lay back, exhausted but quiet, I stayed awake and watched her breathing like I could guard her with my eyes. And when it finally slowed, the quiet question remained. What happens next time? When we came home from the hospital, the house looked the same, but it did not feel like it belonged to us anymore. The walls felt thinner. The rooms felt less certain. I had spent 4 days surrounded by machines and bright lights and people who knew what numbers meant. Back home, the silence felt like a risk. It felt like the kind of quiet that let problems grow without anyone noticing. In the hospital, I had learned details I could not unlearn. I had watched how quickly staff moved when they saw her levels. I had watched their faces tighten even when their voices stayed even. I had seen how often they checked her, how careful they were about bumps and falls, how gently they handled her arms. I had understood, in a way that went past comfort, that her body did not have the normal protection other people took for granted. At home, I could not stop seeing hazards. A table corner looked sharper. A toy on the floor looked like a fall waiting to happen. A normal cough sounded like the beginning of a bleed. I walked behind her without meaning to, close enough to catch her, close enough to block her. I did not like what that made me. It made me feel like a guard instead of a parent. But I also remembered the hospital bed, and I kept moving that way anyway. The hospital had felt safer and more frightening at the same time. Safer because help was a button away. Safer because monitors watched her when my eyes could not. Safer because there was always someone who could place an IV, someone who could check blood, someone who could act. But it was also frightening because everything there carried an unspoken message. You did not end up there for nothing. People did not look that serious over nothing. Words like severe and undetectable did not belong to small children. And yet, they had been written into her chart like facts. At home, I tried to return to normal routines, but normal felt like an act. Even simple moments carried weight. When she sat down to eat, I watched her mouth for blood. When she laughed, I listened for a change in her breathing. When she rubbed her eye, my stomach tightened, and I saw that red pool again, trapped behind the white. I had learned that bleeding did not always announce itself in obvious ways. It could hide. It could collect. It could wait until you looked directly at it. The hardest change was how alone I felt in both places. In the hospital, I had been surrounded by professionals, but the decisions still landed on me like stones. I had answered questions. I had signed papers. I had watched my daughter sleep under thin blankets while alarms beeped down the hall. People had come in and out, careful and kind, but none of them carried the fear home with them. At the end of each shift, they left. I stayed. At home, there were no shifts. There were no handoffs. There was only me listening for the smallest change in her voice, the smallest pause in her movement. I kept the kit in reach. I checked the freezer for cold packs. I kept trash bags ready. I cleaned the bucket again, even when it did not need it, because cleaning made me feel like I was doing something useful. The hospital had taught me how quickly things could turn. Home gave me nowhere to put that knowledge. I also started noticing how normal life did not fit our reality. People talked about plans, about next week, about small problems. I nodded and smiled when I could, but my mind stayed on different questions. How long since her last bleed? How long until the next one? How much her body could lose before she looked pale? How quickly we could get to the hospital if we had to. I felt like I lived behind glass, watching the world continue, while my own world narrowed to supplies and timing and numbers. Sometimes I missed the hospital, and that thought scared me. I missed the certainty that someone else was watching with me. I missed the feeling that if something happened, I would not be the only adult in the room. Then I hated myself for missing it, because missing it meant admitting that home did not feel safe anymore. The location changed, but the fear traveled with you. That became the truth I carried from room to room, from hospital bed to living room floor. And then there was the wish, something that should have felt like pure light, something good that still hurt. The call came at a time when I already felt raw. Not raw in the dramatic sense, but raw in the way skin felt after too many bandages. I had been living in a constant state of readiness, and then someone spoke gently to me about a wish. I had known what Make-A-Wish was. Everyone did. It lived in the background of the world as something good, something bright. When people mentioned it, they usually smiled and called it beautiful. They told stories about kids meeting characters, or going places, or being treated like royalty for a day. It was supposed to be pure relief. So when they told me my daughter qualified, my first feeling was not joy. My first feeling was a cold drop in my stomach, like my body understood a meaning my mind did not want to accept. I tried to force gratitude to the front of my face. I tried to speak with the right tone. I tried to sound like a parent who was excited and hopeful. I did not want anyone to hear the grief in my voice, because grief in that moment felt like betrayal. It felt like I was saying the quiet part out loud. The quiet part was that wishes did not happen for nothing. They happened because someone, somewhere, had looked at the facts of her illness and decided it was serious enough. After the call, I sat in my house and looked around at all the proof I had collected without realizing it. The kit, the cold packs in the freezer, the bucket tucked beside normal kid things, the hospital bracelet I had not thrown away yet, the notes I kept about medications and appointments. I had told myself we were fighting. I had told myself we were managing. And now a wish arrived like a stamp on a file, confirming what I had spent years trying to soften. I felt shame right away, because who felt sad about help? Who felt heavy about a gift? People imagined a wish like a prize, like a miracle. They did not imagine a parent staring at the wall, feeling their chest tighten, wondering what the wish implied. I also felt guilty for my daughter, because she deserved joy without a shadow behind it. She deserved something simple. She deserved excitement that did not come with a second meaning. When I pictured her receiving something she wanted, I could almost feel happiness rise. Then the happiness twisted, because I knew why strangers were offering it. I kept thinking about how the world would see it. Friends and family would say, "This is amazing." They would want photos. They would want updates. They would praise the organization and say how wonderful it was. I could already hear the forced brightness people used around sick children, the way they tried to be upbeat because they did not know what else to do. I worried that if I admitted the truth, that I felt sad, people would judge me. They would think I was ungrateful. They would think I was dramatic. They would think I was making it about myself. But the sadness did not come from the wish itself. The sadness came from what the wish confirmed. It made the word temporary fall apart in my head. It made the future feel less like a long road and more like a narrow bridge. At the same time, the protective part of me kicked in, the part that always tried to turn fear into action. I told myself this was for her, not for me. I told myself my job was to make it special. If this was going to happen, then I would not let my grief stain it. I would help her choose what she wanted. I would let her feel like a normal child who got something exciting. I would keep my face steady and my voice warm. I practiced the smile in my head. I practiced sounding excited. I planned how I would talk about it in a way that kept people comfortable. I thought about how I would thank everyone properly, how I would perform the correct kind of gratitude, so no one looked too closely at the tremor underneath it. But late at night, when the house stayed quiet and my daughter slept, my thoughts got honest. I wondered why my heart had reacted the way it did. I wondered if I had been lying to myself for years, telling myself she was sick, but not that sick, telling myself the next medication would work, telling myself the bleeding was scary, but manageable. The wish did not create the fear. It exposed it. It pulled it into the open and made it impossible to ignore. You could be grateful and devastated at the same time. That was the truth I could not say out loud, because it sounded wrong even though it was real. I needed someone outside this house to tell me I was not a monster for feeling it. I needed a place where I could admit the sadness without watching someone's face change. And that was why I turned outward to strangers for judgment and clarity. I had typed my feelings out late at night with my phone dimmed, like I had been doing something forbidden. I had not asked for a diagnosis. I had not asked for treatment ideas. I had only admitted the part I could not say to people in my real life. My daughter had been granted a wish, and instead of feeling only happy, I had felt sad. I had felt scared. I had felt like the wish was a sign I could not argue with anymore. When I pressed post, I expected silence or judgment. Instead, responses arrived faster than I could read them. My screen filled with strangers reacting to my life like it was happening in their hands too. It felt exposing, but it also felt like air. Like I had finally opened a window in a room that had been sealed for years. The first wave hit like warm pressure, the kind you did not realize you needed until it wrapped around you. People told me in 100 different ways that my reaction made sense. They did not treat my sadness as a flaw. They treated it like proof I had been carrying too much for too long. They described grief as something that could exist even while you still hoped. They described love as something that could look like fear. They pointed out how hard it was to watch a child learn routines that adults should have handled. Those messages did not fix anything, but they loosened something tight inside me. I had been bracing for someone to call me selfish. Instead, people acted like they could see the weight on my shoulders through the words. They said this situation was unfair. They said exhaustion changed the shape of emotions. They said I could be thankful and still be devastated. Reading that, I realized how much energy I had spent policing my own feelings, like feelings could harm her if I admitted them. Then I kept scrolling, and the tone shifted. Another group of people responded like they were looking at a fire and handing me buckets. Their comments carried less comfort and more structure. They did not argue with my sadness, but they treated it like a signal that my mind and body were reaching a limit. They reminded me that survival had to become a plan, not just a reaction. They urged me to accept help without shame, to let other people carry practical tasks when they offered, to stop trying to do every part alone. They warned me about burnout in the plainest way, like they had seen it up close. They told me to rest when I could, even if rest came in small pieces. They suggested keeping track of episodes and patterns in a basic way, not to solve it, but so I did not have to hold every detail in my head. They described the mental load of caregiving as its own kind of illness, something that built slowly until it crushed you. I read those messages and felt a flash of resistance because I had already been doing so much. I had already been preparing, tracking, cleaning, freezing, planning. I had already been the one who noticed first. The idea that I needed more systems made me tired in a way I could not explain. But another part of me understood what they meant. They were not asking me to work harder. They were asking me to stop bleeding out in private. I realized I had been living like I could not afford to collapse, so I pretended collapse was not possible. I had treated my own exhaustion like a problem I could ignore. Strangers were telling me I could not ignore it forever. As I kept reading, another camp formed, and their focus landed on my daughter like a steady hand on my wrist. They spoke less about my feelings and more about hers. They told me to let the wish be joy, not a symbol. They reminded me that children did not attach the same meaning to these things that adults did. They described the wish as a chance to give her a day that belonged to her, not to her illness. They urged me to protect her from the heavy adult storyline, even if I could not protect her from the medical reality. That camp made me cry in a different way, because I had been so focused on managing emergencies that I had started to see everything through the lens of danger. Even good things carried a shadow. They were telling me the shadow was mine, not hers, and that I could choose not to lay it across her experience. I thought about my daughter setting up the kit without being asked. I thought about her calm face during hours of bleeding. I thought about how carefully she watched me, like she read my fear before I spoke. People online were warning me that my fear could become another weight she carried. That did not feel like blame. It felt like a painful kind of truth. The more I read, the more I understood how strangers organized my pain into neat piles so they could hold it without dropping it. Some offered comfort. Some offered action. Some offered perspective. It felt strange, watching my life get divided like that, but it also helped. Each camp picked up a different piece I had been carrying all at once. Online, strangers split the pain into categories: comfort, action, and perspective. For a few minutes, I felt something close to stability, like maybe I was not wrong for feeling what I felt, like maybe I could accept help, like maybe I could let the wish be simple for her, even if it was complicated for me. But the longer I stayed there, the more I noticed another pattern under the kindness. People were not only reacting to my sadness, they were reacting to what they believed the wish meant. For some, it was a beautiful gift with no strings attached. For others, it was a sign, and signs demanded interpretation. I watched the thread start to tilt, slowly at first. The same words kept appearing in different forms. The idea of what qualified meant, the idea of what the organization did and did not do, the idea of whether a wish suggested a timeline, or whether it was simply a way to bring light into a hard life. People began correcting each other with increasing confidence. The warmth in some messages cooled into certainty. As I scrolled, my relief thinned, because I had not come there to debate definitions. I had come there because I felt like I was standing at the edge of something and needed someone to tell me I was not alone. Then the comments shifted again, and the disagreement sharpened into something that felt personal. Like strangers were grabbing the same fragile object from opposite sides. But not everyone agreed on what a wish meant, and that debate turned sharp. Once the debate sharpened, I started reading slower, like each new response could either steady me or push me over. Another group of strangers pushed back against the idea that a wish meant the end was near. They did not deny that my daughter was sick. They did not deny the fear, but they fought the symbol I had attached to it. They reminded me that a wish could be approved for many reasons, that it could be based on impact and hardship, not only a final timeline. They warned me about turning paperwork into prophecy. I felt my shoulders drop a little as I read those, because I had already been doing the thing they described. My mind had been building a countdown out of scraps. A long nosebleed became a prediction. A hospital stay became a forecast. A kind phone call became a verdict. I had been taking every new piece of information and asking, what does this mean for how long we have? Those comments did not erase reality, but they slowed the panic spiral. They gave me a small space to breathe inside the uncertainty. They reminded me that my daughter still woke up in the morning. She still asked for small things. She still laughed at strange moments. She still lived in the present, even when I kept dragging us into the future. Then I found a different camp, and their responses felt like a fist hitting a wall. They were angry, not at me, but at the situation, at the limits, at the unfairness of a child living with this kind of disorder for years. They described what it felt like to try everything and watch nothing stick. They described the exhaustion of hopping for one more option, one more medication, one more change, and then watching the body refuse it anyway. They said it felt like being trapped in a loop where the stakes kept rising and the tools stayed the same. That anger matched something I had been afraid to admit. I had not only been sad, I had been furious. Furious at how many times I had watched blood appear as if it belonged there. Furious at how my daughter had learned to sit down and prepare like a trained adult. Furious at the way people used soft voices around her, as if softness could patch what was happening inside her. The angry comments did not tell me to direct it at anyone. They did not turn it into blame. They treated anger as a normal part of love, the part that stood up and refused to accept what could not be changed. Reading that, I realized how often I swallowed my anger because I thought it would poison the room. But it had not disappeared. It had just turned inward, where it made me feel guilty for being human. After that came the camp that hit me hardest, because they named the thing I had been circling around without touching. They said I had been grieving already, not grieving an ending I did not know yet. Grieving the childhood I thought she would have. Grieving the normal problems I used to worry about before blood became part of our calendar. Grieving the version of myself that did not flinch at a cough or watch a child's mouth for red. They described grief as something that could arrive early, like a storm you smelled before it appeared. They described it coming in waves, not because you were dramatic, but because you were living inside a long crisis that never truly ended. I stared at my screen and felt that word settle into place. Grief. It explained why I had felt sad about something good. It explained why gratitude had felt heavy. It explained why I could smile at my daughter and then collapse in private like my body had been holding its breath all day. I had been mourning a life that still existed but did not look like what I had pictured. I had been mourning innocence. I had been mourning the idea that this was temporary. Those strangers also pointed out something I had been avoiding, that my mind needed support too, that I could love my child fiercely and still need somewhere safe to put the fear, not as a performance for others, but as a way to survive. I kept reading until my eyes ached. It felt strange, letting strangers touch the most sensitive part of my life. But each camp held up a different mirror, and I could not look away. Some people told me not to assume the worst. Some people told me it was normal to be furious. Some people told me I had been grieving for years without calling it grief. Together, they formed something like a map of how humans handled unbearable uncertainty. Not a solution, not a cure, a map. And still, even with all those words, my house stayed the same. The kit stayed where it always sat. The freezer stayed full of cold packs. My daughter's body stayed unpredictable. The comments did not change the past week, or the 5 hours, or the eye I could not unsee. The comments did not solve the problem. They only showed how many ways a person could carry the same fear. When I finally put the phone down, the room felt louder in its silence. I could hear my own breathing again. I could hear the small sounds of the house settling. I walked to check on my daughter, and I watched her sleep like I always did, eyes moving under her lids, her mouth slightly open, her hands relaxed. She looked so young like that. 4 years old. A number that should have meant scraped knees and picture books and sticky hands, not gauze and buckets and hospital bracelets. I sat beside her and tried to hold two truths at once, because that had become the constant work of being her parent. One truth was that I could not control this illness. I could not talk it down. I could not bargain with it. I could freeze more cold packs and buy better gauze and keep the kit perfect, and none of that would guarantee a quiet night. The other truth was that she still needed me to protect her joy, even when I could not protect her body. She needed me to be present with her in the moments that were still ours. She needed me to look at her and see a child, not only a medical crisis waiting to happen. I thought about the wish again, and this time I tried to picture it through her eyes, not as a sign, not as a stamp, not as a sentence, as something bright she could hold in her small hands, something that belonged to her, not to the disorder. But my mind still tried to pull it back into fear. It kept asking what it meant. It kept scanning for the hidden message. It kept trying to prepare me for pain by making me imagine pain in advance. I realized then that this was the core issue under all the comments and all the advice. I could not control the illness, only my next choice. I could choose to live inside panic, or I could choose to live inside preparation without letting it steal everything else. I could choose to let the wish become a funeral in my mind, or I could choose to let it be a day where my daughter felt special for reasons that were not blood. That did not mean I stopped being afraid. It meant I had to decide what I did with the fear. I sat in the dark and felt the same question return, quieter but sharper. How did you stay honest without letting honesty destroy you? How did you tell the truth to yourself without handing that truth to a 4-year-old who could not carry it? If you were me, how would you balance honest fear with creating a happy wish experience for a 4-year-old? I wanted people to tell me what helped them show up for caregivers without making it worse. I wanted practical ideas that did not turn into medical instructions. I wanted to know what kindness looked like when it lasted longer than a single message. Because the thread had been loud, but my life was still quiet, and quiet was where fear grew. I kept thinking about the day of the wish like it was a line on the horizon. It was coming closer, whether I felt ready or not. I knew I would smile for my daughter. I knew I would thank everyone. I knew I would try to make it perfect for her. But I also knew the fear would come with us, packed beside the excitement, folded into the same bag like it always was. The wish was coming, but the bigger question was what we would carry into that day.